Chapter 19. The movement for peace was made up of a bunch of frightened, ignorant beings who believed that any sentients who evolved differently than them must have been inferior. But not all Confederation citizens felt that way. Some liked species who evolved from predators and omnivores. They found these species interesting or charming or magnetic, like vampires in romance novels or something. Whatever his reason, Bordy Opsilic, at least according to the news outputs, was one of those aliens. So instead of conducting his interview in some sterile government conference room, as he put it in his message, he wanted to host us at his home. I'd never much liked the idea of being hosted. It smacked of being on your best behavior and having to clutch little paper napkins. But I also didn't want to say no to a rare opportunity to leave the government compound. Besides, while the change of venue was presented as a request, I understood that we weren't really in a position to decline. I still didn't know how I was going to play things at the interview. Everyone else had decided to give Junip what he wanted, so we could go home. It wasn't that I didn't understand their position. As long as we remained on Confederation Central, with Junip in charge, we were in danger. Every minute I was on the station, I felt the need to get my friends out of harm's way. The fact that Tamrat wanted to come back to Earth with me wasn't doing much to turn me away from the option either. I loved the idea of us being together, but I was worried about what would happen once she got to Earth. She might be detained and shoved off in some dark basement in Area 51. On the other hand, if we introduced her strategically, the government couldn't make her disappear. She might become an international celebrity, and that wouldn't be so bad. I had to hope that Colonel Rage would help us make sure Tamrat remained free and safe. All of that assumed that I went along with the others. But I didn't know that I could bring myself to do it. Urch, Diana, Captain Hyai, and Glee Wixix, I couldn't stop thinking about them. They had died because of the mutiny on the Kind Disposition, and Junip was behind it all. And then there was Dr. Roop, who insisted that everything depended on me going in search of this former technology. I could have set the request aside if anyone else had asked me, but not Dr. Roop. So there it was. I had to choose between betraying one friend or betraying several. I was not looking forward to going to see Bordy Opsilic. Plus, Ardov was coming with us, so that would pretty much make it the worst field trip ever. We walked over to the shuttle landing pad, flanked by 4 peace officers wearing Movement for Peace armbands. I didn't much care for that, but they soon became a blur of alien forms and colors and body types. I had my eye on Ardov. He sat in the front of the shuttle, like the school monitor, and watched us as we strapped ourselves in, smiling at us like we were doing a great job and he was super proud of us. I was harboring secret fantasies of shaving him. The one thing I could say in Ardov's favor was that he hadn't singled Tamrat out for any special attention. They ignored each other, and Ardov and Vilonik hadn't done much more than give each other wary glances. I had to figure that there was some sort of caste thing going on that I didn't understand. But considering how cruel he had been to Tamrat in the past, I wasn't complaining. A couple of rows in front of me, Vilonik was looking nervous. Tamrat was showing him the passenger safety information on her data bracelet. Life preservers under the seats, just like in airplanes, impact gel cushions, inflatable life rafts, and, as our shuttle would be going over water, all kinds of things to keep him alive. I wanted to tell him that he shouldn't be afraid of flying. He should be afraid of the beings he was flying with. Interim Director Junip has little faith that you can conduct yourselves properly with reduced supervision, Ardov announced once we were off the ground. But Bordy Opsilic insisted on conducting this meeting at his residence, so we have no choice. I expect all of you to be on your best behavior. I know it's sometimes difficult for primitive species to resist their violent, disruptive impulses, but you're going to have to try. Frankly, I think it's a risk taking you all out of the compound. He then turned away like he was startled by something. Or maybe embarrassed, because it seemed to me he'd just drawn attention to something very peculiar. Why exactly were Steve and Tamrat along for the ride? They hadn't been on the Kind Disposition. Junip had said something about using them as character witnesses, but I thought he'd meant to get Volonic to testify against us. Something wasn't right here. I leaned over to Colonel Rage, who was sitting next to me, and I very quietly pointed this out to him. His one eye went wide with alarm.
"Yeah, that's a good point, son," he said quietly. "Kinda makes me worried."
"Worried about what?" I whispered.
"That they're all putting us together so something can happen."
"If you've got something to say," Ardov snapped, "speak loud enough for the whole shuttle to hear you." "Are you feeling excluded, Ardov?" I asked. "It's the sort of tribal behavior I'd expect from lower life forms," he said, "but I'm afraid I can't have you whispering. Also, I've closed down your personal comm channels on your bracelets. The last thing I need is for you to plot some kind of foolish escape." "Where would we escape to?" I asked. He sneered at me, as though I'd been immature to point out the absurdity of his accusation. "I don't expect you to behave rationally." I sighed and leaned back. Colonel Rage and I exchanged a glance. There was nothing more we could say now, but we were both keeping our eyes open. It seemed increasingly likely that we were headed into a trap. It took us about 20 minutes to get to our destination. I'd never paid much attention to the mountains surrounding the city on my last visit, but now that I knew Glee-Wixix and apparently Dr. Roop wanted us to venture into underdeveloped wilderness and the periphery of the domed platform, I found myself looking out the window at the jagged and stony peaks to the far horizon. There was a desert out there, hot and barren and dangerous. From our position dozens of miles away, it looked like no one could last long in that wasteland. Finally, the shuttle set down on the landing pad atop a tall cylindrical building with a bright green metallic exterior. We filed out of the shuttle and into the building, and then into a large elevator that opened directly into Bordy Opsilik's apartment. I immediately got the sense that serving on the Xeno Affairs Judicial Council must be a pretty good deal, because Bordy Opsilik had some sweet digs. The place was large, with huge windows that presented a view of the sprawling city and the wilderness beyond. There were furnishings that might have been expensive, I didn't really know what counted as fancy in the Confederation, and various works of holographic art. Even without knowing the cost of the individual objects, I had no doubt that this was the apartment of a very wealthy being. The name Bordy Opsilik hadn't meant much to me, but now that I saw him, I recognized him instantly. He was a large, dare I say rotund, fellow with molted red and black skin and slight protrusions reminiscent of stubby horns on his forehead. During my previous visit to the Confederation, I thought of him as looking like a Darth Maul, if Darth Maul had been a clown. He looked a little silly, but more than once he'd taken my side against Junip, which made him okay in my book. He wore a red suit that matched the red parts of his skin, and he looked happy to see us. He opened his arms. "Welcome, friends," he exclaimed. "Do come in. Peace officers, there is no way for them to escape, and I do not fear for my safety, so please remain here while I lead my guests inside." Ardov stepped forward. "Director Junip has asked me to remain with the primitives at all time." "We would not want interim Director Junip to worry now, would we?" Bordy Opsilik said. "Come along then, come along." He led us into another room, and then down a hallway, and finally to another large open area with numerous chairs. Numerous chairs, oval couch-like things, and tables set up with plenty of food. "Look around, friends, look around. In my apartment you will see that I believe in the finest collection of primitive art in the Confederation." There were paintings on the walls, large metal sculptures in the corners, and carvings of wood and stone on the tables and shelves. Some of them looked fairly simplistic, but most of them looked like variations of ordinary art you might see in a museum on Earth. Maybe I didn't find any of it strange because I, myself, was a primitive. "I have ordered refreshments for our chat," Bordy Opsilik continued. "As you can see, there is plenty of replicated animal flesh on which you may feast. Oh, and you, my Ishi friend," he said to Steve. "I know you prefer flesh to be alive and fearing its demise when you force it to succumb to your power."
"I might do," Stephen said warily. "Hadn't really thought of it that way."
Bordy Opsilik strode across the room, grabbed what looked to be a small rectangular fish tank, and handed it to Steve. Inside, it was crawling with creatures that looked like furry shrimp, each one about as long as my finger. Steve took the tank in one hand, fished out a creature with the other, and popped it into his mouth.
Bit early in the day for sweets,
he told Bordy Opselic.
but these are quite good.
I wasn't really in the mood to eat the animal flesh Bordy Opselic had thoughtfully provided, and no one else seemed to be either. After Steve threw a few more hairy shrimp into his mouth, we all took our seats. Bordy Opselic remained standing in the middle of the room.
Now, he said, I would love to show you my collection of primitive kitchen implements, gathered from the most backwards planets in the galaxy. I know they would make you feel very much at home. Who is up for examining some ladles?
How about we just get down to business,
said Colonel Rage.
Certainly.
Bordy Opselic rubbed his large hands together.
I admire your simplistic rejection of manners.
That's how we primitives do things,
the Colonel said.
Charming. Now, as you know, we must make a full investigation into what happened aboard the Kind Disposition. This is not an official inquiry, of course, but I am recording the session, and what you say will become part of the public record, so you must consider your words as equivalent to testimony. However, this is a friendlier venue than an official hearing, and I hope you will feel more relaxed and candid to speak freely, using the colorful local idioms of your own cultures.
We were all silent for a long time. Colonel Rage had his hands clasped, and he was looking into the space between his knees. We all knew what we had to do if we had any hope of Junip letting us leave the station, but getting things started was not going to be easy. It was one thing to decide you were going to be the guy who helps a weasel escape punishment and rise to power, but it was another thing to actually do it. So here we all were, trying to figure out what we valued more, justice or our own lives. No, scratch that. I think everyone else was thinking what I was. If it were just me, I'd go for justice and take my chances. But I couldn't ruin everyone else's chances of getting away.
Can this be?
Bordy Opselic asked.
No one wishes to speak.
I opened my mouth to say something, but I couldn't make any sounds come out. Velonic looked around the room. He then cleared his throat.
It is my understanding that everyone who was on that ship regrets his or her actions that led to its destruction. Indeed, I have often heard them say that Interim Director Junip is in no way to blame for what transpired.
There was a long silence.
Interim Director Junip?
Bordy Opselic said, articulating each syllable as though it were a hammer blow.
Was not on the Kind Disposition, so why do you raise his name?
Velonic looked somewhat sheepish.
I only wish to emphasize that the mayhem, while perhaps not caused by these good beings from Earth, can in no way be blamed on the Interim Director nor anyone who might have been following his orders. And who are you, precisely?
Bordy Opselic asked.
Said
Velonic, who now rose and began doing those fancy things with his hands and feet. It did not get any less stupid with repetition.
I am Velonic, 5th Sikon of House Agitage, 3rd rung of the Caste of the Elevated.
Tamret began to study the inside of her sleeve. She looked very much like someone who wished she could fold herself into a paper airplane and fly herself away.
How interesting,
Bordy Opselic said.
I find your gestures and the implications of your culture fascinating, but I am not certain what you are doing at this meeting.
Ardov cleared his throat.
Chief Justice, Director Junip thought, because of your interest in primitive species, you might enjoy the company of the Ishi and Rarls. I see, said Bordy Opselic. Very thoughtful of him. I must also say it appears that the interim director has coached these beings on what they should say to me. I don't believe he would do so, said Ardov. Director Junip does not behave unethically. It is, in my opinion, disrespectful and disloyal to imply otherwise.
There was another long silence, this time because there was nothing any of us could say. If we were to launch into our scripts, in which we covered up the mutiny, we would only look like idiots, parroting what Velonic had just said. If we confirmed that the mutiny had taken place, we would be giving up our only possible means of escape. As odd as it seemed, Velonic's blunder had actually gotten us off the hook. After a few more minutes of sitting and saying nothing, Bordy Opselic coughed politely. Perhaps this
gathering was not in the best of ideas. I was foolish to think that Junip would not have made such promises or threats or otherwise poisoned any chance of candid conversation. We shall have to reconvene this inquiry in a more formal setting, but I can assure you that my investigation into Junip's role in the destruction of that ship will be most vigorous. Something is horribly wrong here, and while I believe a crime has been committed, I do not think that it is you simple-minded and kind-hearted primitives who are to blame.
Let's not be too hasty, Colonel Rage attempted. Bordy Obzilic stood up.
I shall now excuse myself. Please partake of the refreshments to your satisfaction. You may show yourselves out when you are done.
With that, the Chief Justice rose and departed from the room. Ardov looked at Volonic. You are a complete moron, he said. Normally, I'd been in favor of a conflict between these two, but in this case, I was so full of relief, I thought I ought to come to Volonic's rescue. Give him a break. It's not like any of us are trained at this. He made a mistake, that's all.
Of course you would defend him, Ardov said. He just saved you from having to...
His voice trailed off.
I can't believe it. I didn't see it earlier. You told him to do that, didn't you?
Nope, that was 100% Volonic, I said. Ardov was now striding towards me.
Of course you did. That seems to be exactly the sort of thing you would do. You're given two options, and you come up with some sneaky way to achieve a third choice.
That is kind of like you, Smelly said. Volonic stood up and placed himself between me and Ardov, which was kind of a brave thing to do.
No, I can promise you that Zeke did not tell me to say anything. I am honestly not sure what I did wrong, but I can tell you the blame is mine alone.
Ardov studied him for a moment.
You may be just stupid enough to be telling the truth.
I agree, I said, so stop giving him a hard time. Ardov looked at the two of us and smirked.
It won't make much of a difference at this point. Let's go.
We all followed him out of the room, Steve going last, taking a moment to grab a fistful of hairy shrimp.